Good afternoon, everybody. Today, Rob and I are going to cover the nation-state threat source that we started last week. I'm, as always, Don Hester from Mays & Associates. I'm an IT auditor, and Robert Duruk, he works for Indiana University, and he teaches cybersecurity courses there. Just as a side note, I kind of want to start where we talked about last time and then kind of just summarize it really quickly for anybody that missed last week's lesson. It's online, so you can go back and watch it if you'd like to. This week, we're just going to follow up with what we started talking about. And the biggest thing that we found is that there's been an increase in nation states as actors, as a threat source to our organizations, whether you're a business or a government, and that has been increasing over time. Or maybe it's always been there and just our awareness and knowledge of it is increasing. Don't know which one it is, but all we know is that, hey, we now have a new risk and an enemy that has considerable resources behind them. So it's worth us to take a moment to try and figure out where they're coming from and what their goals and motives might be. So that might help us figure out different ways of protecting against those. Now, I also said last week there's some common actors that are out there, and this by all means is not all of them. There's a lot of other nations that are doing it, but who pops up in the news most often? And it's everybody from us, the United States, to our allies, whether it's the UK or Israel, but we also find that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea seem to also be ones that we would traditionally think are not necessarily enemies, but people that we are that may be aggressive towards us, or they may have it in for us or our way of life or whatever. And this increase has not gone unnoticed, and it pops up in the news all the time, and there's a number of articles and reports talking about it. If you go to the RSA conference every year, that you'll see that there's more and more sessions talking about it over recent years. And you'll also find out that as we find out more about them, we find out that the sophistication is higher in the type of code that they're using or the attack method that they're using. That increases our risks. And we found that some of the attacks that we have now attributed to nation states have started to cost billions of dollars. And it is a little bit of a threat to our way of life. We talked a little bit about that last time, and you know, if we're trying to filter out, you know, from a psychological warfare point of view, we're trying to filter out those bad actors who are trying to sow discord. That may also infringe upon our freedom of speech. So how do we weigh that out? So there is somewhat of a threat of our way of life, but also a threat to the stability of the nations as they are. Whether the U.S. is considered top dog or not, there is a threat to that from an economic standpoint. So the other thing that we've also kind of talked about is everybody's kind of a target. It's not just nation states attacking other nation states, or they're only attacking the industrial military complex. It's not just that. They are actually attacking just about almost everybody. Everything from local governments to small to medium-sized businesses to very large businesses in the tech sector, and everybody in between, it seems to be. So at this point in time, we just need to step up our game at this point in time. So their goals vary, and we talked a little bit about last time talking about you know, psychological warfare, propaganda, disinformation. We also talked about actual attacks against critical infrastructure and some of the examples of what Russia did in the Ukraine. We're going to talk now a little bit more on the theft of things like intellectual property, intelligence, counterintelligence, and a lot of this kind of comes into also economic warfare, if we can use that term here. And so we're going to talk about cyber espionage, and actually espionage in general is replete with examples of them using technology in the past for spying, right? So the idea that today there's a subcategory of espionage called cyber espionage, I don't know if it's really a subcategory, if espionage just includes all of these tools, which we sometimes dub cyber. But what we've noticed is that there's more use of the technology, and more of it is an attack against different organizations at different levels. So sort of what we're going to talk about. It's not just the federal government that has to worry about these things, but it's also other organizations. So just as I have a couple topics that I want to make sure that we when we say cyber espionage, we used to call things industrial espionage, and that's where we were trying to, nation states might, or other companies, because it may be a nation state, maybe a company, trying to get industrial secrets or intellectual property from somebody who owns it to give them a competitive advantage, either give the nation state a competitive advantage or give another organization a competitive advantage, and that's kind of what it is. When it's a nation state sponsored it, it's more of a, what we might call economic warfare. In other words, boost our economy by tearing down somebody else's economy. One of the interesting things about this is most of those leaks that happen, 80% of them are from insiders. So that's an interesting thing. One thing that you'll kind of, as we go through it, and we'll talk about it at the end, is as we go through this and I talk about some of the examples of what happens, and you think about big data and how it might apply to this situation, because I think towards the end we'll get into that. I think, now, we have the traditional military advantage that someone's trying to get, and obviously there's a competitive or economic advantage that people want to get, but there's also this high idea of having a technological dominance in the world over other adversaries. That's one of the things that we're looking at, but it also is from a perspective of a nation state, if you steal intellectual property, it may reduce your total cost for research and development. You may not have any research and development costs. You're going to have some cost in trying to go out there and procure the information from somebody who's already spent all their money on research and development. You see this in the pharmaceutical business all the time, where stealing the cure for whatever is a huge business. So it's definitely something that's there. And there's a lot out there with it. I can't cover everything that covers espionage from a cyber perspective, but we have to remember that, I love this one, I always said there's 5 apps for spying on your spouse. So we're talking about things on all different levels. You can get nanny cams that you put into stuffed animals, to watch your kids or watch your babysitters. There's all kinds of websites about how to spy on your spouse, or for employers to spy on their employees. There's hardware devices that you can put into your machine that are keystroke loggers that are virtually undetectable by software, because it's a hardware device that goes between your keyboard and your computer. We have everything from people using drones now to spy on people, and it's not just like flying over somebody's backyard so you can go look into their windows, but it's also using drones to land a drone on top of a rooftop and hack into the wireless of a building or something along that lines. And we also have nation states that are using spyware against the dissidents in different locations. So there's a lot to it, but we're going to just focus a little bit more just on the nation states. Yes, there's all these other things, but I didn't want to neglect and not say them, but I want to start off with that. So this is nothing new. There's industrial espionage, what it used to be called, and some people just say that industrial espionage is no longer, it's an antiquated term. And in some circles, it started very early. And 2 examples of this, 2 fathers of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States actually went to England, stole secrets that it was against the law to steal, to bring back to the United States to get us a cotton mill and to get us a power loom, right, which kind of launched a little bit of the Industrial Revolution. So even the United States has engaged in this. Now, was that government sponsored, or was it just businessmen sponsored? It was probably just the businessmen. So it's more of a company versus a company type of espionage, but it definitely helped the United States as a whole, and it definitely did put England at a disadvantage, or the United Kingdom. I do want to say that, yeah, we talk a lot about industrial espionage, but there are some legitimate uses for this called competitive intelligence or market research, where you go and try to find out everything that you possibly can about your competition from legitimate sources, websites, people that have posted things on the internet, open sources, so to speak. And all of that's legal. You can do all that. If a company puts a secret out on the website, they lost the secret, right? So from that kind of point of view, those are legitimate aspects. And so if you go in and take a course at college that's about competitive intelligence, it's usually about that. It's usually talking about the open source means of getting information without breaking the law. Doing what these two gentlemen did, Francis and Samuel, is basically would be considered against the law. So think about those things. And again, that's not nation state sponsored, but it did affect both nation states economically. I wanted to start off really talking about nation states, where we first have our first example of nation states really progressively working on and working in the direction of espionage, specifically to tear down another nation's economy and promote their economy, their own economy. And the Soviet Union had things that were called people's correspondents. And basically, there were people that worked in factories, or they worked here in the United States or other Western nations, primarily in Europe, but here in the United States as well. So they worked for factories, and basically what would happen is the USSR would send questions to them, like, what kind of materials are used at the factory that you're working at? You know, questions like that, so that they can gain information and try to use it to better their production and their research and development in the Soviet Union. This was completely nation-state sourced, and it was against technology or industry, so to speak. And basically what they were trying to do is eliminate research and development costs by figuring out who's done it better and then do it themselves. Those people's correspondents would report back with the answers to the questions, or write up a report on anything that they saw that they thought was important for the Soviet Union. Most of the people involved in this were doing it for ideological reasons. In other words, the reason why they were doing it was because they didn't believe in the free market society, or they believed in socialism or communism. And there's a lot of reasons behind why the individuals would be behind this. And that's a whole other discussion about the psychology of why someone becomes a spy, or why they would turn stuff in. But that's one of the reasons. Most of the time it was ideological reasons. In other words, they believed in what they were fighting for, or what they thought they were fighting for. So here's a good question. Is it illegal to access information that was illegally published? That's a good question. So when Snowden had put forth the documents that he had, I got a notice. I was working for a federal government agency, and I received a notice telling me that I was not to go and look at those documents. Everybody else in the world was looking at them, but we were told not to. I'm not sure why the federal government said, hey, these are our secrets. They got published out on the internet, and all federal employees can't look at them, but that's what they did. So I don't know that it's illegal to look at illegally punished stuff, published stuff. I think, and this is a question, actually, I should probably get a lawyer to answer this question. My understanding is, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV, and I'm not pretending to know one, but I've heard of instances where if your information, like you have a secret recipe for the best chocolate chip cookies in the world, if it were to be published by a disgruntled employee and it gets out there on the internet, you haven't done adequate measures to protect your intellectual property, and now that it's in the open, you can't protect it anymore. But I'm not 100% sure on that. So I'd have to ask a lawyer on a good question, but I'm not 100% sure. I've heard of things where once it gets into the open market, you're pretty much SOL, but I don't know for sure if that's the case. So good question. When we talk about nation states and hacking, or not necessarily hacking, but using cyber espionage, we do have the traditional cases. In other words, the nation state is trying to get military secrets. And this was from last year, I believe it was, article talking about how North Korea actually stole plans for our fighter jets that we have that we sell to Australia. And they also stole some other plans that the U.S. and South Korea have for wartime contingencies. So they got a lot of information through their espionage activities, which was really kind of, you know, the typical thing that you're expecting a nation state to do. And if we think that nation states aren't doing this, then we're a little bit naive. I mean, I'm not trying to say, hey, everything's like James Bond, because it's not. But nation states are going to try and do everything that they can to give themselves a military advantage over another. And that has always been the case since the beginning of time. When cavemen are running around with rocks and stones, somebody's trying to figure out what kind of rocks and stones he has so they can get better rocks and stones. You know, that's just the way it is. So to think that they are using cyber means to do this now is duh, right? It's like the idea that weaponizing artificial intelligence, yeah, that's pretty much going to be a thing. And Putin's already said that that was going to be a thing. So anything that's a useful tool that can be weaponized will be. I mean, I just watched the Jurassic Park movie, and what are they trying to do with the dinosaurs? Weaponize them. I don't know how they're going to really weaponize dinosaurs. I mean, that's the plot of the story. But, I mean, you know, you see this idea. If there's new technology, how can we weaponize it? But here's one of the things that people don't think about, and that is that they may be trying to, nation states may actually be trying to get intellectual property from you, or trying to get trade secrets from businesses. And most business travelers are completely unaware of this. They don't know that other nation states might want the information that they have, especially if you work for a high-tech company. You work for somebody like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Cisco, whoever it is, pick any of the high-tech companies that are out there, guarantee that other nation states would like to have some of that information. So, so the question is, are we telling our employees that they should be watching out for this? And that's one of the things that I think that a lot of companies have not really developed in their cybersecurity awareness programs is that, hey, you know, they will go so far as to go into hotels where there's conference rooms and put wiring devices in their bugs, you know, to eavesdrop on conversations so that they can find out things about mergers and acquisitions and all kinds of things like that. Because it's fairly standard practice. Well, it's not, I don't know if it's really standard practice, but a lot of organizations, if they're going to work on a merger or something with another company, they will tend to go off-site to a neutral location between two companies, also not to raise any suspicions of employees, you know, because, you know, if you're Microsoft and you're acquiring another company and they come into your office and some employee's going to say, hey, why are they here? Maybe we're going to purchase them. Maybe I should go buy some stock, and then insider trading and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of times they will go off-site, other locations. But this is what you end up running into, is that is you go to another location, is it wired? Are they trying to do it? Especially if you have information that they would really like to have. And I think one article had called it cyber-enabled economic warfare, and I really like that. It's a mouthful to say. It's easier to say economic warfare or cyber warfare, but in reality, it's really espionage, right? We're trying to get information. And we're just, what do we do with that information is going to be dependent on what that information is. And it kind of doesn't surprise me. So in 2012, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act had this statement. I was going to read it. I know don't read slides, but I'm reading them. China is the world's largest and most active, persistent perpetrators of cyber economic espionage. U.S. companies have reported an onslaught of Chinese cyber intrusions that steal sensitive information like client lists, merger and acquisition data, pricing information, and the results of research and development. This illegally acquired information gives Chinese companies an unfair competitive advantage against the companies from which they stole it. So this isn't anything new. This is something we've known about. This is something the Russians did before World War II and through World War II and after World War II. So there's no reason why we should think that this is unheard of. And we'll talk a little bit. Rob, you had posted that article, and you said something last week about the Chinese chip that may be in all the different electronics. Well, that doesn't surprise me at all. When I heard it, I was like, well, they figured it out. I mean, tainting the supply chain has always been an issue. It's always been a risk that has been theoretical out there, and now we've seen them execute it. So that's an interesting thing that we're starting to see some of the predictions actually come true. Interesting thing on China's side of things is they like to spy even on their own people, right? So they sometimes get, dinged for human rights violations and things about limiting freedom of speech, and anyone that's a dissident gets put away. Well, they're using companies to spy on their own people to do this. And their companies, and so it's an interesting thing when you're a company in a country like China is that the government may come in and they can hassle you. They say, hey, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. So spy on people, and we're looking for people that, are against our nation, and we want to get rid of them. So we're going to have you spy on them for us. And you can't really say no. It's interesting that some U.S. organizations that had presence in China have cut off their ties from that. They either spun off a subsidiary, moved all the assets from that company that were in China in there, and then basically, cut the ties so that it's two separate companies to make sure that they can, because some of the requests that the Chinese government have would go against, our ethics here in the United States for sure, but also against just the way we try to do business here in the U.S. and the rest of the world. So it's interesting they do that. Now, this is an interesting, and there's a couple lessons from this one. One of the things is that China broke into the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, and basically stole the information from, 21 million current and former U.S. government employees. And I'd be one of those. That my information is now in Chinese hands. It's in a big, huge database someplace, and what they're doing with it, I don't know. I don't know that I've seen any results of any fraud or any identity theft with it, so the question is what are they doing with it? Now, to give you a little bit of history on this, because I think this is kind of really important to understand at this point in time. In 2015, when this happened, there were people that were saying, we think China's behind it, and they had the reasons for it, but the government never came out and said, yes, China is behind it. So, and China would say, all these people and all these news articles are saying that we're behind it, and that's really irresponsible of them, whatever. During that period of time, about a year later or so, the FBI arrests somebody, a Chinese national, connected with the malware that got into the OPM. And then a couple weeks ago, so remember this happened in 2015, this is 2018, September of 2018, the U.S. government came back and said, oh yes, by the way, we knew it was China. So I just want you to understand that from 2015 to 2018, it took that long for the U.S. to come back and say, yes, we confirmed that it was China. Up until that point in time, it was an allegation that almost everybody believed, but it wasn't confirmed. And now that it's confirmed, it kind of gives you an idea. Now, you have to think about this. What's the lag there? Why did it take so long for them to come out and say, yes, this is what it was? And some people think that that was politically motivated, and I don't know about that, and I'm not going to get into that. I just want you to see that there's this lag of time between when people say something happens and then when you actually find out what was the truth behind the story. You will find that as I talk about some of the other incidents here, you'll see that big lag as well. And sometimes it's a very short lag, sometimes only a couple months, but there's always, when something new comes out, there's a lot of people speculating who might be behind everything, and it takes a little while before it actually gets confirmed. A good example is the WannaCry, it was linked to North Korea, and it didn't come out until much later that it was linked to North Korea. So that's, I don't want to say, I just want to say that it takes some time sometimes. Someone asked a question, I believe that sometimes industrial customers do not hesitate to share information from their suppliers. There's not much a supplier can do to stop it. And that's, it's absolutely true. I think a lot of that has to do with getting into security awareness and for your employees and explaining to them what is intellectual property and why is it important. And the way that it's important is that you still have a job, right? Because if a company's not profitable, they may not be able to keep you around and employ. So it's important for those secrets and sensitive information to not be listed out. Obviously, there's stuff like OPM data where it's personally identifiable information. Now, if you think about this, what kind of information does OPM have? The OPM has information on basically everything you did to get hired for the federal government if you work for the federal government. So if you had a background check or you have a security clearance and what went through that and what was the results of that, all a part of the data that they have on your case files for you as an individual. So that data is the data that got leaked. So if you think about it, if China has all this data, they know who you are, they know what security clearances you have. If they wanted to target a particular secret that may exist in the federal government, maybe they want to get into NASA and figure out something about rockets or something. And they go and they look in their OPM database that they now have, and they go and say, okay, who has security clearance and who works at NASA? Right, and now they have a list of people that they can then go into and say, okay, these are the people that we need to target for espionage. Let's see who we can turn into. What kind of dirt can we grow up on these people? Let's compare it with the Ashley Madison breach, right? So the Ashley Madison, if you don't remember that breach, that gave off a list of names of people that were, it's basically a hooking up website that's kind of on the down low, so that if you want to cheat on your spouse, that you can go there and find a date or whatever. So now if you want to blackmail somebody, you just have two pieces of information. You kind of put those two pieces of information together. Maybe they also look at your Facebook account and see if there's anything there that they could work on, or your Twitter feed, or whatever else. So it's interesting to think about what they could do with that information. And as our government, I hope, has taken, I don't know, because they haven't said anything publicly about it, but like, what are they doing to make sure that blackmail doesn't happen, right? For people that have maybe what seems to be lower level clearances. Interesting thing is, so China gets, so sometimes it's Chinese government that's behind the hacking, other times it's not. It's Chinese businesses, and there's a difference between the two. Recently, the Chinese government came out and said that their businesses, they're going to pass some laws to protect intellectual property. The reason they're saying that is they need to say it, they need to have U.S. businesses still do business in China. And if they stop doing business in China, then that's going to hurt their economy. So they're starting to pass laws to do it. There's an intellectual property index that basically kind of looks at their laws and says, hey, are there laws there that are protecting intellectual property? Well, yes, there is. The problem is that we find that the Chinese government is still behind some of these things. So does the government follow their own laws or not? That becomes a really good question. So even if we have an index that says, yeah, they got laws in place and they are punishing business owners in China that are doing these things, but what are they doing to stop themselves? That's a separate question. So even if they're on this index, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily protecting intellectual property. It just means they have a law in the book.
I think another question, or another point to make is, even though they may have laws, how strict are they enforcing those laws? Like, the government can say, look, we have all these laws, but if they're not really willing to enforce them, then it's kind of a moot point, right?
Yeah. I mean, we can have laws on the book about not spitting on a sidewalk, but how often do you see that enforced?
Right.
Big difference, I get it. But we are, the United States is, and we've caught a number of cybersecurity professionals who are charged with hacking into different companies to steal business secrets and then selling them to either Chinese companies or to the Chinese government. So the question is, who's really behind it? And I have to say that this is a politically charged issue. And the reason why it's a politically charged issue, so let's just get it out there in the open and talk about that aspect of it. The current president has put sanctions on China. One of the rationales behind those sanctions is that the intellectual property theft has cost U.S. businesses this much, and so we're going to charge through taxes China basically that amount of money that U.S. businesses have lost. The problem is it doesn't get it back to the businesses that lost the money. It just means our government gets it through taxes. So I don't know if that solves the issue or not. But so some people see that as like, whoa, this is politically motivated. Other people see that the reason why China was not called out for the OPM breach was because that the past president did not want to disrupt relations with China. And the reason why it's being announced now is because the current president doesn't care about it. I don't know about all that stuff. I'm not really worried about it. I understand that there's a lot of political motivations behind everything. I'm neither supporting one president over another. What I want to make sure is clear, however, is that that issue does come up, and so some people will say, this intellectual property theft is not a really big issue. The problem is it really is, and whether or not, whatever your political affiliation is, that's besides the point. And why you might want to do one thing for another because of foreign policy, that's another issue. All I want to talk about is that they are doing it. We know they're doing it. There's plenty of evidence that they're doing it. And the question is, how do we as companies, organizations, local governments, federal governments, state governments, how do we protect ourselves against those things? That's really the question that we have to have, especially since they're very sophisticated. Now, this isn't anything new. This goes back a while. I think this goes back to like 2013. That China actually used a kettle, you know, one of those hot kettles that you get that warms up hot water so you can pour tea in it or whatever. They actually put a Wi-Fi device into there that could break into Wi-Fi networks and then try to grab information off that Wi-Fi network and send it back to China, to sources in China. Maybe it was the business, maybe it was the government. Don't know on that particular one. But so it's been around for a while. This is not something new where this is just another way of them trying to get into spying in other organizations. The problem is, I think a lot of the kettles are going to be in people's personal homes. So what are they trying to get in there? That I'm not sure. And that's an interesting question. But I mean, I could only speculate what they may or may not be up into in that type of situation. Last week, I think Rob had said something, and I saw it. We both see it. So we were kind of excited about it. Not that we were excited that it happened, because it's a bad thing that it happened, but we were excited because we were going to talk about cyber espionage, and voila, everything is provided for us in the right amount of time. So here it is. Here's a brand new, fresh out the presses thing that, hey, Apple, Amazon may have spy chips in their hardware, and of course they're denying it. And so let's be honest with that. They're denying that it's in there. So we'll talk a little bit about that going forward. But remember when we talked about that last time when China broke into the OPM, it wasn't until recently, less than a month ago, that it actually came out and was confirmed that it was them. I mean, everybody suspected, but it wasn't confirmed. Now it is confirmed. And it took a number of years. So
well,
yeah, go ahead.
Just to add, I put a couple of announcements on there. The first one was actually linked to the first report that you were talking about. And the second one is the report from the OPM and why it took so long. So apparently, I'll summarize it for you real quick, but the security staff at OPM was monitoring the X1, that's what they classified his name, intruder, the hacker, and they were monitoring his movements within the organization until he got close to that database that contained the clearance information and background checks on the employees, right? So it wasn't until that particular point in time that they created what was called, they deemed it the Big Bang. That's what they called it. And unfortunately, their process of the Big Bang didn't actually eradicate him completely, and he left segments of keystrokes and keystroke loggers and stuff like that still rampant in the OPM network, still exfiltrating out data. So they didn't even clean it all up. And this was a report that was written and published back in 2016. So they're still cleaning it up. And I think part of that problem is that they still are monitoring the movements within the organization as a counterintelligence. Because once they can understand what they're doing and what they're trying to get after and who's actually behind it, that's when they release that information. I think that's ultimately what had to happen, was that they could actually trace it back to not only the geographic location, but actually who is responsible for that in that geographic location. So it's one thing to say, well, this attack came from China, but it's a completely different thing to say this attack came from, like, the Chinese government or Chinese corporations that are working on behalf of the Chinese government.
You know what's interesting about that too is there was another report about some other attack where the IP address comes from the Chinese government's hacking group, the specific building that they know it's at. That's where some of the attacks were launched from. I mean, it's really hard to deny it if the IP address is your IP address and it goes directly to your hacking group. So yeah, that's interesting aspect to all of this. Looking at this part now, so using hardware as a way to hack into something, which is what came up last week. And we'll see how this plays out as well, because Apple and Amazon are saying, hey, it's not on our devices. And I think that remains to be seen. Now, Bloomberg says they have a lot of sources, and a lot of those sources basically break down a lot of information about how they think the chip got onto the motherboards, and then how it got into the companies that are reselling it. So it's poisoning what we would call the supply chain way back at the very beginning of it, when the motherboards are actually being made. This is a very interesting article. I'd recommend that you go take a look at it. It was just published on the 8th. So October 8th, I think, is when it was published. So it's like this week's hot information. And again, one of the organizations that had the chips on their motherboards, Supermicro, basically they're saying that the claims in Bloomberg's article are completely spacious and they're incorrect, and they don't have any hidden chips on theirs, on any of their motherboards that they make for other people. So because they make motherboards and cards for devices that go into typically servers and those types of things. Which, if you're thinking about it, if you're trying to do a hardware hack and get into the hardware somewhere and put your chips on somebody's hardware, you probably want to get it on the server side of things if you can. So it totally makes sense that they would do it. It totally makes sense that Supermicro is going to say, no, we're not here. I don't know whether it really is or isn't. Well, time will tell on this, because this is like breaking news, so we don't want to go forward and say, yes, they're absolutely a part of it or that they knew about it, but we'll see how things play out in the coming weeks and what comes out from it. What's interesting about it is you probably won't hear anything more about it in the popular press. In the security articles and cybersecurity stuff, it may pop up from time to time, and it may get lost, we used to say in the back page of the newspaper, because something bigger is happening that day of the week. So it'll be interesting to monitor this story going forward. So basically how it comes, the way that they play it all out is here in the middle, kind of in the middle is, or let's start all the way from the left side here and just start off with the manufacturer is in China. They build motherboards that another company sends them the designs to make. They make those motherboards, they send them back to that company then resells them to another company, and that company then sells those servers with their software on it to businesses and government entities. So you have the supply chain, and the supply chain is a little bit longer than this, obviously. There may be middlemen in there, and there may be something before the actual manufacturer of the motherboard, because they may not manufacture the chips. They may make the motherboards and put the chips on the motherboards, so some of the electronic components may be made elsewhere. And obviously, like the silicon's probably made someplace else as well. So there may be a longer chain, but what we know about the current chain is that either through intimidations or bribes, and if you think about it, if you're a factory in China, and China comes to you and says, hey, we're going to pay you X amount if you take this motherboard you're making, we want you to put this chip on it, and here's the specifications how we want it put on there. And if they say no, then it turns into from a bribe to intimidation, and it may be, look, if you don't do it, we're going to inspect this factory, and if we inspect it, you may get closed down. So there may be some, heavy-handed, it may be that they're getting money, and it may be heavy-handed the way the government handles it. Don't know, but that's the way it's kind of portrayed. To put this tiny little chip on that motherboard. You saw a little picture of it in the last slide. It's so small you'd miss it, right? So then it goes to the manufacturer, who then puts it together for servers, and then they sell it to someone who then resells it. In this case, it was a company here in the United States that was then selling to different governments. And that company was being purchased by Amazon.com, and that's where Amazon's kind of getting into the middle of all of this, why their name pops up. And there's stories that Apple knew about some of this stuff maybe back as far as 2015 with some of their servers and stuff like that. So that's an interesting thing as to whether or not that's true or not, and whether it's linked to this particular one. So anyways, go ahead.
The thing to point out is in the report, it also states that just Apple themselves had something like 7,000 of these super micro servers in their data centers. So you can kind of imagine the information that is being stored based off of the use of iPhones, right, and iTunes, and their ability that they would back up those devices up into the, I'm going to use the term loosely here, up into the iCloud, right? So those are all running off of super micro servers. So if those chips were, in fact, in those servers at that time, what kind of information are they gleaning from all of these items that are backed up? Because you also have to remember, here's another tie-in, right? A lot of people don't understand this, but back in 2014, 2013, the GOA, right, that's our Government of Accountability, they came out and said that government employees no longer had were restricted to purchasing BlackBerry smartphones. At this point, they could go out and purchase an Android-based or an iPhone-based because they both had the capabilities of doing on-device security, right? So you could encrypt the drive and everything else. Because up until that point, it was really, BlackBerry was the only one that was out there. It was making secure devices. So once they came out and said that, now what do you have? Now you have government agencies and government employees who want to go out and purchase, an iPhone. Why? Because that's the coolest thing to use or the best thing to use, whichever way you want to brand it. But they're now buying these devices to be used as their daily mode of mobile communication. And what kind of conversations are they having? What kind of data is being transmitted and stored on those devices? And now all of that is being backed up and synced up into the iCloud, for example. And I'm only using that as to tie it into the 7,000 servers that were running iCloud that have the potential that they could have been compromised because of this chip that was sitting there, right? So this is, again, more of a broader brush to paint, but this is the time frame of why you see that type of attack on the infrastructure and the supply chain, because if they can get it into that mode and they can get a little chip onto a server that has the capability of compromising it, look at the data that they're getting. And yes, a lot of that stuff may be from a consumer standpoint, but that's not really what they're after. They're throwing a really wide net with the hope that they're going to land that one, that two, or that three big fish that they're really looking for, and that's their target. And they don't really care if they captured 2 million consumers. If they got 5 government employees that they can glean secrets off of, then that's what their target was.
Well, think about, but here's a bit broader question. Like, now that they have all that consumer data from consumers, I mean, what is the potential that they could use it for? That's one question. And then in the future, I mean. But then also, think about this. How are they going to deal with all of that? They got 4 million different accounts that maybe they're able to get access to. What are they going to do to weed through all that information? How are they going to weed through all that information to find the gem that they're looking for? I mean, because basically they're looking for a needle in a haystack. So I think that's a part of the interesting thing is, like, how are they going to use all that? And I think that one of my interesting things is, or one of the things I really think about, this is where big data kind of comes in. And how do you take a large amount of information and then sort through it all to actually turn it into something that's actionable, right? So from a nation-state point of view, you want to find those 1 or 2 big fish that you want to get into, how are you going to do it? But if you think about it, if these chips are able to actually circumvent the operating system and then inject code at a lower level than the operating system, basically they can get into anything on the machine, whether it's encrypted or not, whether or not it has a password or not. They can intercept the password. They can take that password, and then maybe your password that you use to log into your government account is what they were really after. Right? I mean, so
right.
this kind of makes it. And then what about multi-factor authentication that relies upon phones that if it's in a phone? If they get a chip like this in a phone, right? So a lot of things doing it. So one thing that I do have to note, and it's important because there's a couple articles that talk about it, and that is that it's not always the Chinese government. Sometimes it's Chinese criminal groups, organizations, and sometimes it's companies that are just trying to get information. So you have a plethora of people from China breaking into everything, and whether or not the government's behind it all or whether they're not behind very much of it, they're behind some of it. That's what we know, and that's kind of what we're trying to say. And I think one of the Bloomberg articles really did kind of like talked about what their goal is, and it basically says that China's overall goal is just long-term to look for high-value corporate secrets and sensitive government networks. That's what they're looking for. That's their overall goal. So your personal information that you have on your phone, whatever that may be, is not really of an interest to them. So they may be spying on you. They probably are spying on you, but on the other hand, you probably don't have anything they want. So that's interesting. However, if you think about this, if they have all that information on you and one day you run for office, maybe you want to become president of the United States, that would be interesting. That would be really interesting, what they might be able to get out of all this stuff. Now, we do have to say this, and that China's not the only one that does it. And we know that the NSA has a long history of working either with businesses here in the United States, whether it's Juniper Networks or RSA, and they do have a program where they spy on people here in the United States. And Snowden kind of put that information out there. And this is spying on, government spying. And again, the other thing is, when this came out, I was like, really? Is this news? Because I just assumed that they were. I mean, they're a spy agency. They're spying. Okay. They're spying on us. Well, of course. They don't know what we are, and they're trying to figure out, are we a threat or are we not a threat? I mean, that's their goal, right? So it did not surprise me one bit, it did. What it surprised me is that people thought it wasn't happening, that nation states are spying on even regular citizens. I didn't get that. I think one thing that might have been more of a surprise to me is that intellectual property would be something that would be a major target. I get that. Now, I probably wouldn't have thought about that 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago when I first got into cybersecurity. I probably wasn't thinking like that. But I definitely thought that nation states were probably spying on everybody. And it has been the case over the years that even the Great Britain or the United Kingdom has also been doing it. They have a specific surveillance program. They've hacked into fiber optic lines so that they can monitor communications. They hacked into webcam photos for people using Yahoo Messenger. So if you were ever on Yahoo Messenger doing nudie talk with somebody else out there, there's probably a picture of it somewhere in some server in the UK. Anyways, again, why are they using it? I don't know. But what were they looking for? They're probably looking for things. Again, they're not looking for that particular thing or what you're particularly doing or what you're talking to, whoever you're talking to with. They're looking for probably the same types of things. Maybe not so much corporate secrets, but secrets about people that may be trying to expose information that would do harm to their nation state. So that's probably what their deal is, but who knows? Now, we can't talk about this without talking about Kaspersky Labs and the big fiasco that came last year or the year before, whenever it was. Now, and again, this is one of those things that did not surprise me one bit, that, another nation state would go to a company in their nation state and say, hey, you're going to work for us, because the NSA did that. So why wouldn't Russia do that? I mean, why wouldn't they play the same games? If it works here, why wouldn't it work there? So to me, whether or not Kaspersky themselves, the corporation, knew that they had somebody internal that was doing it, or whether that was all completely obscured from them and a hacker from, the Russian government actually infiltrated their organization, or whether or not, like they say, there was no connection with the Russian government. They're obviously going to deny it. Now, when this story first broke, and the way it broke was really interesting. It came out overnight, U.S. government, all government agencies are going to stop using Kaspersky Labs. And they said it's fine for everybody else to use it. At that point in time, I said, yeah, I don't want to use it anymore. Not that I was using it, but I was like, okay, this is my notice call, because anytime the federal government says something like that, you should pay attention to it. Even when they say don't worry about it, you should worry about it. Now, again, if the idea is the naive approach of it, and why I disagree with why the federal government did the way they did, they're saying, hey, look, we're going to stop using it, but it's all right for you to use it. And maybe that's what they had to say, but that you should read between the lines. The thing is, the assumption there is that the Kaspersky incident that was only targeting specific information. Well, if intellectual property is one of the things that they possibly could be targeting, then everybody is a potential victim, not just federal government employees. So just taking off federal government employees' machines may not solve what the problem was. Anyways, the nice thing is, or the bad thing is, the federal government didn't say anything other than that. Just said, hey, stop using it, federal government people. We later find out that, well, this espionage thing is a little bit more complicated than we thought. How did we find out that they had this information? Well, we found out we had somebody working for the NSA who was taking information out and putting it on a computer. They shouldn't have been doing that. Somehow that Kaspersky information, that Kaspersky application took that information and sent it to their networks. That information was found on their network. So the information somehow got from his laptop to their network, right? So that raises a question. Well, was he submitting it because it looked like it was a bug? I mean, it was a Word doc. Why would the Word doc look like it was a bug? Anyways, or some type of malicious code. We found out about it because Israel had hacked into their network and was snooping around, and they found the documents, and then they tipped off our government, right? So this is the web of espionage that's going on. I mean, everybody's hacking everybody. So I mean,
well, and I think what's interesting in this one is it's not just again, it's one of these statements of you have to clearly define it, right? And what I just posted up there is this outlines that it's the Israeli government hackers. So this is nation-state sponsored hackers who are now going after Kaspersky and finding out that there are NSA tools that were in Kaspersky's, their systems. And they, in turn, told the NSA that, hey, your secret tools are now sitting at Kaspersky. You better figure out how they got there. And it's just pretty interesting. But again, it's nation-state sponsored is, I think, becoming more and more prevalent, right? And it's not just like somebody, a group within that particular boundary of a country that is hacking. It's now they're actually sponsored by the actual nation.
Well, and I mean, let's think about this logically. Kaspersky didn't know that Israel had hacked into their systems. So do we really believe the fact that they don't believe that the Russian government hacked into their systems? I mean, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but Kaspersky dropped the ball. Whether they were complicit in it or whether they weren't complicit in it, they dropped the ball. All right, so we can at least agree on, at least I hope, that much. They would probably disagree with that. And this becomes a whole other issue about supply chain. Again, do you buy your products, your security products, from other countries? And if you do, how are you going to do it? And how are you going to verify that their code isn't spying on you anyways? When this becomes a really interesting and challenging issue with supply chains. If you go back to that supply chain where we talked about the chip being put onto the motherboard illicitly, how are you going to catch that? right? Because what happens? They send a design. They send the design to the manufacturer. They tell the manufacturer, give us a run of X amount of these devices or these motherboards. Send it back to us. We're going to do some testing on it. What kind of testing do they do? No. Generally, they just plug it in and then make sure it boots up and does all the things that it's supposed to do and all the functions work. And then they say, yes, that's good. Send us a whole bunch more. Now the question is, when did that little chip actually get put onto it? Was it in that first batch that was tested, or was it a later batch? So now it's a question of quality control. Now, every motherboard that comes from that company that you outsourced in China, are you going to test to make sure it doesn't have that chip? And if you don't know what kind of chip they have, what are you testing for, and how do you know to test it? I mean, most of the testing that they do on that is like bench testing, puts a program on it, runs all the little functions to make sure the motherboard performs within the specifications. Is there a check that looks for anything illicit that's on the motherboard that shouldn't be there? And then is there a way to make a chip that hides itself so that they can't find it, right? So there's all these questions. The only other thing you can do is like an optical check that says, here's a schematic of what it should look like, have some kind of scanner scan it, and then look for something on that motherboard that is not supposed to be there. And look how small it is, right? So really interesting, but it's one of those things that I think that we don't want to be naive about, and then we want to understand what the risks are to this. I mean, personally, on a level, I think someone asked a question, not to be paranoid, but as a consumer, I could be suspected of espionage if I was using Kaspersky. I don't know. As far as paranoia goes, paranoia is you believe something that's not true, and the truth is they are out to get us. Question is maybe what is your risk personally from a personal standpoint versus what's the risk to organizations. So me on a personal level, if I found out that my phone had a chip on it, I would probably replace the phone or get it replaced because I wouldn't want them spying on me. But really, in reality, what might they get out of it? Well, I'm a cybersecurity professional, so maybe they want my information. So, on a personal level, maybe there is a risk there. I'm not going to run for president, so I don't have any other risk like that. But, it's one of those things you kind of have to, it's not about being paranoid, it is the fact that they are out to get you. What they're going to do with the information and how that might harm you, different story altogether. And it may never harm you. It may harm the company you work for, right? So, and again, this last slide just basically saying, hey, everybody's doing it. RSA is doing it. RSA and NSA work together. Juniper Networks work with NSA. So if Kaspersky Labs worked with them, then it totally makes sense, and it doesn't surprise me one little bit if they were complacent working with them. It also would not surprise me if the Russians got in there without their knowledge. That would not surprise me either. Because again, they have some fairly sophisticated attacks in the way that they do it. The guy that was stealing the files and that ends up getting the information sent to Kaspersky, he was caught. I mean, I throw this in here because nobody hears about this kind of stuff. You just hear about Russia and Kaspersky and U.S. computers, and that's everything everybody talks about. But, the people that are actually doing these things, and I don't know if you saw a couple of slides earlier, some of the people that are engaged in the espionage, or they're the ones that release the information, they are being caught and they're being punished. The problem is they're not the real people behind it. They're a pawn in the game. And so if you ever get blackmailed, you should whistleblow. Because guess what? They have no vested interest in going after you if they know they can't compromise you, right? So what are they going to do? They really going to go in and release the information? Probably not, because if they can't get you, the threat is only good if they know that you're afraid that they'll execute it. If you're not afraid that they're going to execute it, the threat's no longer valid. And they will turn and burn you. They're going to say, we don't know who this guy is. They're going to disavow you, and they're going to let you go to jail for the rest of your life. So don't ever become a stool pigeon for them or an espionage agent. Another interesting thing, and kind of want to finish up with this, and that's basically open source intelligence. And Allen Dulles in 1947 basically testified before Congress and said basically all the information that you need for public policy about what other nation states are doing and all that 80% of that information is available in above board means. You don't have to go and try and do espionage. The information's there. It's somewhere out there. You just have to find it. Now, finding it is the difficult part, right? Because the internet's a huge place and there's a lot of information out there. Today, the estimates range between 80 and 98% of the information that is needed is out there. So the question becomes, this is where big data and artificial intelligence really come in, because searching for a needle in a haystack is very difficult, but this is where using what we know about big data and artificial intelligence to find those connections that you would never guess before, that's how they're going to be found. So you don't even have to worry about espionage in the traditional sense of trying to do all this other stuff that China and Russia is trying to do. A lot of the information is probably already out there. So a part of what big data is working on is how do you take all this information that you got and remember that OPM breach and all the information they got from that, and then remember all these other ways that they're probably getting information about U.S. customers, all the other breaches, Equifax breach or the Ashley Madison breach, all those breaches. Imagine if you had one huge database with all of that information in it. What could you do with all of that information? How could you correlate that data? And how could you analyze that data to pick targets for blackmail and all that other stuff, right? Well, that may seem like a daunting task, but now when we talk about artificial intelligence, maybe it's not such a daunting task anymore. Now that should scare you a little bit. Because that's beyond what we're even capable. We can't, as human beings, we can't go through that terabytes and exabytes of information, look at everybody's Facebook, post to kind of try and correlate if they know another person or something, all these other types of things. But that information can be found. Maybe not by humans, but definitely by artificial intelligence. So interesting book. It's a little expensive because of like a textbook, but it's really interesting to take a look at. So the question is, where's my privacy in all this? So if you're concerned about your privacy, you don't have any. So let me just end your fears right there. And then also point out this, that, we're the biggest perpetrators of getting our information out there. This was a survey that they did, and it said LinkedIn has resumes for people. 27,000 U.S. intelligence personnel have information on their LinkedIn profile that they shouldn't. One saying that they work in intelligence, using things like code names for projects they worked on and stuff like that, all stuff that they're not supposed to do. So again, when we say that 98% of the information is out there, guess what? It probably is, and guess who's probably putting it out there? And they didn't have to do a spy kettle to do it. They didn't have to put a little chip in a motherboard to find out a lot of this information. A lot of it's out there in social media. So the next big area of looking and getting information is through those means of the open source stuff. So if you have any other questions, please go ahead and feel free to send us questions. Please go ahead and rate us and then sign up for our channel, follow us, and you can check out our blog, learnsecurity.org. We have another session coming up next week. We're going to talk about the importance of cybersecurity awareness. In the future things, we're going to talk about vulnerability scanning versus pen testing. What do they test where they need to? We'll talk about a really cool feature called a DNS firewall. We'll talk about what is needed for cybersecurity documentation, what's IT governance versus what's IT management, and we'll also be talking about some PCI compliance and some of the best practices there. We focus mostly on local government and small business, but it applies sort of to everyone, a lot of these topics. So thank you for joining us. Do you have any last words, Rob?